things we talk often about on Ag PhD is plant tissue analysis to find out what's actually getting into the plant in terms of plant nutrients, but we also have to take a look at soil tests. And so if you know what your soil test is, you know how your plant tissue analysis is turning out, a lot of times there's an opportunity to put more nutrients, especially nitrogen, on as the season progresses. The question is, how are you going to do that?
What Brian's getting at is side dressing corn and putting nutrients off to the side of the row. Now you could certainly foliar feed at this stage.
Well, right in between the rows.
But if you need to put lots of fertility out, like with nitrogen, for example, on some ground that I own, I've got cation exchange capacity numbers as low as 12.7. Well, if your cation exchange capacity is 12.7, you can only put about 120 or 130 pounds of nitrogen on in one shot. Well, I'm shooting for 175 bushel corn. Well, with that much yield potential, I need plenty of nitrogen. I can't do it all in one shot. I am forced to side dress because, yeah, I could foliar feed a little bit of nitrogen out there, but I certainly can't make up 50 or 70 pounds of nitrogen with a foliar.
Okay, if you're going to put nitrogen out there later in the season, we always talk about these nitrogen stabilizers, and we think nitrogen stabilizers are worth a lot more than they used to be because, number one, we have better products like Nutrisphere N, for example, or Instinct. Also, we have a lot higher commodity prices and a lot higher nitrogen prices. Nitrogen probably costs 4 or 5 times what it did half a dozen years ago. So it's a valuable investment to protect, and if we can keep that nitrogen from going up in the air or leaching down in the ground, that's worth a lot. And also if we can keep the nitrogen in the ammonium form that plants actually use, then the plant needs less energy to use that nitrogen instead of having to take in nitrate and convert it back over to ammonium. So there are good reasons why we want to use nitrogen stabilizers. But then the other question is, how exactly are we going to put this on?
Well, there are a couple different ways you can do it. Now let's just talk about nitrogen, for example. Depending on where you're at and how much rainfall you're expecting to get, most of the time at side dress, we like to use liquid nitrogen. That way that liquid will hopefully get down in the soil a little bit if we're applying it on the surface, like say you're dragging hoses in between the rows, for example, or if you're injecting it just below the surface, maybe 4 to 6 inches down. That liquid is kind of nice because you get a little bit of moisture and all of a sudden that nitrogen becomes available for plant roots and they can take it in. Now you may be using anhydrous or you may be using a dry product like urea, for example. Those can be done too. The urea definitely needs to be under the ground. If you're broadcasting urea on top, I remember back 15 or 20 years ago, there were guys that liked to broadcast that urea out on corn that was about knee high. And they said they were getting some degree of control on corn borers by dropping some of those urea pellets down into the corn whorl. Well, guess what? You were probably losing most of that nitrogen to volatilization when you were doing that. And with urea, you need to get moisture pretty quick to break those pellets down, and then has to be plenty of moisture to help push it down into the soil as well. So I don't like gambling with urea unless you had irrigation and we're going to run a couple of inches of water over it in the next few days. With anhydrous, personally, I don't really like it. I think it's more dangerous to apply. It's not available everywhere, so sometimes you have to drive quite a ways to get it. And putting anhydrous out there, it takes a lot of time. You really can't pull that big a rig. I'm just not a big fan of it. I greatly prefer using liquid.
Well, the other reason why with the liquid is it's a lot safer than the anhydrous, and that's kind of what I look at on our own farm. It's a lot easier to go out with liquid, and I can inject it down into the ground. That's where you should have a little bit better success. It's going to be obviously more stable if we don't have to worry as much about volatilization. Now, there are many other nutrients that you should look at besides just nitrogen. With phosphorus and potassium, it's kind of the same deal, though we start talking about dry versus liquid. We do like dry P and K for some situations, but probably not for side dress because it's not going to be available very quickly. So that's where we would suggest using a good liquid product that will have much better availability. Then you need to focus on sulfur, micronutrients. There are a lot of different nutrients in total that your crop needs. You got to make sure you're addressing everything. And ideally, we'd like to have these things done at planting time or preferably before planting time, but especially if you have lighter soils, you're going to need to come in with a side dress application of some more fertility.
Really, when it comes to a side dress type application, you're able to split rates up, and a lot of times it's the most efficient way for the crop to take it in, just a little bit at a time, and you can get by with a little less total fertility than if you try to put it all out in one shot. Like let's say you put all your fertility out in the fall. Chances are you're going to lose some of that in one way or another. It's either going to get tied up, you're going to be losing it to volatilization or leaching or something like that. So putting it all on in the fall is not a great opportunity for guys. Putting it all on the spring, yeah, it's nice to get it all done at one time, but guess what? You're going to have to put on too much if you want enough
well,
to
not
be
as
there
much
later
as
in the
not
season.
as much as in the fall, but you still have some risk of loss if you're putting it on in the spring. This way, if you do a little bit in the spring or even a little bit in the fall, but then you follow up with the rest of it in the summertime when your crop could actually use it right then, you have a lot less risk for loss. You can actually get by with a little bit less total fertility, spend a few less dollars, be a little bit better for the environment because you have less risk of loss, and in total, you should end up with the same yield and the same result in the end, and that's kind of what we're all after. So that's why side dress has gotten so popular in certain areas of the country.
Well, fertility is very important, and so is weed control. Can you identify this week's weed of the week?